the way it came about was that perhaps in reference to my own writings, I said, well, the chairman's writings were very important. And he said, in his self-deprecating way, he was always speaking in self-deprecating ways. Anybody who does not have an inferiority complex usually can speak in a self-deprecating way. And he said, well, I never wrote anything that was worth much. Then I went on to say, but what the chairman wrote changed China and changed the world. He said, I haven't, with a smile, he said, well, I haven't been able to change anything except a few places around Peking.
In your book, Leaders, you write of Mao that, and your impressions of him, that his willpower somehow seemed a physical characteristic. How did you form that impression?
Mao is one who has great animal magnetism. That's something you would not ascribe incidentally to Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai was subtle, sophisticated, suave, smooth, cerebral. Mao was emotional, physical. Something very difficult to describe, but it's there, you can sense it. Khrushchev was the same way, incidentally. He also was a very physical presence. I'd say the same thing for Lyndon Johnson. I wouldn't say that about Kennedy, for example. That's the differences between various people.
Do you think Mao Zedong had problems justifying to his own people dealing with a right-wing anti-communist from the United States of America?
Oh, certainly. But he was not a bit defensive upon it. I remember when we were talking with his usual twinkle in his eye, he said, I voted for you in your last election. I assumed that he meant by that he favored me over Senator Humphrey, or Vice President Humphrey. But then he went on to say that, he said, you know, I like rightists, right-wingers. He said, I am always comfortable when the right comes to power. And he was referring to the Germans, to Heath in England and so forth. And
Did he mean this, or was he being humorous?
No, I think he meant it. I think he found that the right was more dependent. Let us understand how Mao's mind worked and how Zhou Enlai's mind worked. Let me start again. Let's understand how Mao and Zhou Enlai looked at China in 1972, at the time this new relationship with the United States took place. Why is it that Mao was to say that he liked right-wing governments? Because right-wing governments were the very antithesis of what he stood for. And the answer is that as far as the Chinese are concerned, their primary interest is China, always China. That's number one. Their secondary interest is philosophy. It doesn't mean that Mao Zedong was not a very dedicated Marxist communist, call him what you want. And the same is true of Zhou Enlai. But where there is conflict between the ideology and their security comes first. And so as far as they were concerned, in Iran, they liked the Shah of Iran, even though he was anti-communist. And they did not support the Tudeh party, which was the communist party in Iran. And as far as we were concerned, we were their ideological enemy. But on the other hand, as far as the security of China was concerned, we were absolutely indispensable to that security. And so as far as the Soviet Union was concerned, the Soviet Union was Marxist, communist, call it what you will. So was China. But the Soviet Union threatened China's security. And so every time you look at the Chinese, you've got to think of them in those terms. They're going to be thinking of China. What is going to be good for China? And if a right-wing regime is going to be more in their interest than a left-wing regime, they'll just put the left-wing regime right down the shaft.
On that point, we are going to break for a Chinese meal.
All right?
Go. Lunch break. 35 minutes.
when he was talking about liking rightists, Mao, in that self-deprecating way of his, said, you know, he said, sometimes I think that people like me sound like big empty cannons. We talk about overthrowing everybody. We will overthrow the imperialists, and we'll overthrow the revisionists, and we'll overthrow the capitalists. He said, after all, if we overthrow everybody, we're not going to have any friends left. So sometimes we have to get along with the rightists, and that, of course, he meant us.
You've described in your memoirs and in Leaders the differences between Mao and Zhou Enlai. What were the main differences that you noticed between the two men?
Well, Mao, I would say first, was fundamentally, well, let's start again. I don't want to give the answer to the question. Well, Mao basically was a physical creature. I say that in not a condescending way or a condemnatory way, but in terms of simply appraising him for what he was. He was more emotion, whereas Zhou Enlai was more intellectual, more brain. That doesn't mean that Mao was not a fairly learned man. After all, he wrote great poetry, at least great poetry from the standpoint of the Chinese and the revolutionary forces, and also read a great deal. But he primarily was one who approached problems in an emotional way. He appealed to the heart. Zhou Enlai, however, appealed to the head. I think that was the fundamental difference between their approaches. The second thing is that Zhou Enlai was a highly sophisticated, highly civilized person. Mao, on the other hand, was just what he was, a former peasant, very earthy, very down to earth. Zhou Enlai was, however, we must have in mind, not because he was simply a civilized person, a weak person. I remember Walter Robertson, the former Assistant Secretary of State during the Eisenhower years, telling me once about a story that he'd heard about Zhou Enlai, that Zhou Enlai was absolutely ruthless, that one time he came out of a room in which he had just killed one of his rivals, calmly smoking a cigarette. And there's no question that Zhou Enlai, along with Mao, are responsible for the killing or starving to death of millions of Chinese. So under the circumstances, therefore, we're not dealing here with a great humanist, even though he had humanist and humanitarian appearance. Having said all that, though, I would now come to a general appraisal of Zhou Enlai. Many times, I guess more often than not, people ask me, who was the greatest man you ever met? And here in answering the question, if the question is who was the best person, that's one thing. Who was the best president, the best king, the best leader, that's something else. Who was the indispensable man? Churchill was indispensable, for example, for Britain at the time of World War II. De Gaulle was indispensable for France during the period that he served. And Adenauer was indispensable for Germany. Yoshida was indispensable in creating modern Japan. In terms of comparison with these others, we would not say that Zhou Enlai was indispensable to the Chinese Revolution. Maybe Mao could have done it with somebody else, although Zhou was very effective. But I would say in terms of rating and comparing Zhou Enlai with the other world leaders that I have met, there was one area that he was without question number one. He was the greatest diplomat I've ever met. He was suave, poised, he had enormous stamina, he was always prepared, he was very tough when necessary, appeared to be conciliatory when necessary, always appeared to be reasonable, but never gave in on anything he possibly could, where he thought that giving in would not serve his interests. I think perhaps the phrase that best describes him is one that Churchill used in describing Parnell, the great Irish patriot of the 19th century. He said that he was a volcano under an ice cap. And I think that this probably describes Zhou Enlai. Beneath, there was a volcano, but on top it was an ice cap. And that made him the effective diplomat that he was.
How can you talk with such admiring objectivity about a man who had the blood of several millions of people on his hands?
Oh, I'm admiring him for his capabilities as a diplomat, for his capabilities as a leader at the time that I dealt with him. I'm not admiring him in terms of his past record. That is something else again, just as I'm sure he didn't admire, for example, the United States for what he considered to be our capitalist exploitation of the masses. I totally disagree with his appraisal of our system and what we have done, and certainly he disagrees with my appraisal.
Should the United States deal with regimes or leaders whose policies include internal murder? Should, say if Hitler had wanted to reach some kind of a sensible understanding in terms of U.S. interests with Franklin Roosevelt, should he have treated with Hitler, regardless of the internal arrangements?
Well, there didn't seem to be any possibility that that would happen at that time, but I think Churchill, just turning the subject around, put it fairly well in context when he was criticized in the House of Commons for making common cause with communist Russia after Hitler invaded Russia. And I think Churchill said something to the effect that, let's see, what was it?
That he would make a pact with the devil.
Let's see. I think I'm going to miss that one there. Where Churchill defended his making common cause with Stalin, even though he had previously been intensely critical of him, putting Stalin and Hitler in exactly the same boat, and after the war, incidentally, he continued to criticize him. But at that particular time, when Hitler was the major enemy, he made common cause with him.
How did you, or how do you answer your critics at the time, particularly your conservative critics, who said that by going to China, you legitimized this brutal anti-American regime, and that in fact their policies hadn't changed, that the masses of murders that had occurred in the 40s and 50s and the Cultural Revolution were perhaps past, but that they still have a brutal, murderous, oppressive regime there?
Well, the Russians haven't changed. The Chinese haven't changed. Eastern Europeans haven't changed, except moderately in terms of their treatment of their own people. And over a period of time, however, change possibly may take place. What I am simply suggesting here, that clearly apart from whether they have changed or not, looking at the fundamental responsibility of a president of the United States, responsible for the security of this country, failing to have a rapprochement with the People's Republic of China at that time would have been inexcusable and unacceptable, because frankly we needed them just as much as they needed us. And if we didn't have that rapprochement today, I repeat, we would be in an impossible position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. You take the Soviet Union, you add the billion people that are in China with its enormous resources, and the whole balance of power in the world tips irreparably against us. And that is what we are helping to prevent.
What does it feel like to sit across the table from a man who had killed someone with his bare hands and walked out of the room smoking a cigarette? Does it occur to you that he could do it to you under similar circumstances?
I don't think of that, and I doubt if he thought of me in terms of the way he had heard me described as the capitalist devil. We were both pragmatic. We both had other things to think about that we thought of higher priority than what had happened in the past, and that's the way we approached it.
Is this attitude towards these leaders and regimes an exception to your conservatism?
No, I would say that in the whole foreign policy area, that I believe what it is most important is that it be an effective foreign policy and one that will always put emphasis on our primary responsibility, and that is to have our system survive. It must survive because the United States, whatever our faults may be, is the hope of the world. We are the main force that deters the only major nation that threatens war or defeating other nations without war, and we are the nation that will certainly defend freedom wherever we possibly can when it's within our capabilities.
But if we compromise our principles, doesn't that make our survival not worthwhile, or the same nation isn't surviving? Don't you have to stand up at a certain point and be willing to die for what you believe in?
As a matter of fact, war compromises principles. War is evil. All war is wrong. All killing is wrong. The question is, for example, when Eisenhower ordered the bombing of Dresden, which was a civilian target, and 40 million Germans burned to death in one night, that certainly was immoral, but it would have been more immoral to allow Hitler to rule Europe. That's what it gets down to.
What was Zhou Enlai's health like in your observations of him?
I had heard that.
On that last one, he said 40 million people died on that. Do you want to say 40,000?
Yeah, we'll repeat that.
Let's do a pickup on that. That's a good. You don't need the question in again.
No, I'll just.
That's
I'll
a
just
long
repeat
question.
that.
Yeah,
No. I'll cover it.
Pick up Eisenhower's decision.
Mm-hmm. Ready? Well, you take Eisenhower's decision for the bombing of Dresden in World War II. It was a civilian target. And the firebombing of Dresden cost 40,000 German lives in one night. Now, that was immoral, but it would have been more immoral to allow Hitler to rule Europe. And those are decisions that leaders have to make, and sometimes they are terribly difficult. That was a difficult one for Eisenhower, as he often told me thereafter.
What was Zhou Enlai's health like in your observation of him on this trip?
Well, his stamina was unbelievable. We'd have these long, long meetings. You see, every meeting is twice as long as it would normally be because while he understood English and quite a bit of it, he never spoke in it, so you had to have the translation. And we'd go on for 2 or 3 hours in the morning and 3 or 4 hours in an afternoon. And then he would spend half the night working with Kissinger on the details of memoranda and so forth and agreements that we had discussed earlier in the day.
When did he sleep?
He slept apparently after midnight. I talked to Miss Tang, who was one of the translators, Brooklyn-born, brilliant, and she said that he got along with 4 to 5 hours, 4 or 5 hours a day. I noticed on occasion he took a little white pill during the day. I don't know what it was. And of course, as we know later on, he died with what was diagnosed as either cancer or a form of cancer, leukemia. But his stamina, as I said, was unbelievable. A couple of things indicated to me that he was not as good health as he was. At the big state dinner when we were toasting each other in Mao Tai, which is the fiery Chinese brew, which he proved how fiery it was by pouring a bit into a saucer and lighting a match to it, and it practically exploded. He told me one amusing story, too, that it was so strong it's been known that when one fellow had drunk too much Mao Tai, he lit a cigarette, he blew up. And so as he was talking about Mao Tai, he said that during the long march, he had on occasion had as many as 24 cups. That's a small cup, about 24 ounces in one day. He said, now, I limit myself to 2 or 3 ounces.
What does it taste like?
It's just like wood alcohol. It's a fiery brew.
How did you handle it during the
I just sipped it.
toasts going around?
As a matter of fact, you can practically get drunk smelling it. And what happened was the custom is Chinese style that after you propose a toast, you go around the entire table of 20 or 30 of the honored guests and tip with each one. You hold up your glass, look them in the eye, next one. And I went around and so did he. And I noted when each of us had finished our round of 24 drinks, we still had half a glass left. That's how we stayed sober for the talks that were to take place later that night.
Andre Malraux had told you that the Chinese would be struck by the age of your party. Was that, did that turn out to be the case?
Age constantly came into it. I know that Zhou Enlai one time, to my surprise, said how impressed he was by our advance team, and they were an excellent team. They did a marvelous job of advancing. Dwight Chapin was one of them, and he was only 33 at the time. I thought that was young. But Zhou Enlai also mentioned Marshall Green, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia, and Marshall Green was 51. but he thought he was young too. But you see, Zhou Enlai was 73 at that time and still had the vigor of somebody of 23. He was a man of enormous physical vigor and mental discipline. Another thing that Zhou Enlai impressed me with was his attention to detail. You know, usually we say leaders shouldn't pay much attention to detail, and sometimes many of us get too immersed in detail. But I recall, for example, that he checked over every item on the menu at the state dinner to be sure that it had been prepared exactly the right way. And I understand the reason he did that was he was a very good chef himself. I pointed out to him that Eisenhower had also been very proud of his cooking ability, which pleased him a great deal. Another incident that proved that, Bill Rogers is telling me that on one occasion when he was having a meeting with Zhou Enlai, they brought in the Daily World, or whatever it was called, the Chinese Communist daily newspaper, and which was to come out the next day. And he personally edited it while he was talking to Rogers about some of the other matters that we had to discuss at that time. And I recall particularly when the day we went to the Great Wall, it had been snowing, and we were attending an event in the gymnasium, a big gymnastic event. And I noticed that about halfway through the event that Zhou Enlai got up and left, and I just assumed, well, he's 73 years old, he probably had to go to the men's room. That wasn't it at all. As a matter of fact, he came back, and what he had done, he went out personally to check to see whether the people he had ordered to go out to sweep all of the roads clear of snow had done so that the roads would be clear when we went to the Great Wall, and they were pristine clear. How he did all those things, and yet saw the forest and not just the trees in our conversations, was a very remarkable achievement. I can understand why one of the major Taiwan leaders, the government there, said rather wistfully after they had lost China, he said, if we had had Zhou Enlai on our side, we would have won.
We have a picture from that gymnastic exhibition, which I think you, in your diary of the China trip, you commented what a tremendous impact and impression this site made on you.
Yes, I recall the event very well, and I also recall, as I look at that picture, what I heard when I was in Pakistan in 1965 from Ayub Khan. He was a strong anti-communist. He had just come home from Peking because he'd become disillusioned by the administration, the Johnson administration's treatment of them leaning too much to India and the rest, and was turning toward China himself. And I said, what was your impression of it? He said, primarily people, millions and millions of people, the enormous potential strength of it. And there, in that picture, as we were there that night, I saw these people, but what impressed me more than the fact that they were young and vigorous, which they were, was that they were so totally disciplined. And I could see what an enormous force that would be under the control of any leader who was opposed to us, and why it was therefore important to attempt to influence that force in a way that would not be against our interest. Nothing brought home to me more vividly than that night, seeing that demonstration of not only vigor but also of discipline, the vital necessity of not only beginning the China Initiative but nurturing it from there on out.
Do you think American youth has vigor and discipline today?
A lot of it has. Let me say, let's not be unimpressed, even though I know that most of our elitists in the educational community would not approve of what I'm just going to say. Let us not be unimpressed with some of the bans and other things that we see at football games and the rest. No, our young people are capable of discipline. And we wouldn't want them to be like the Chinese people. We wouldn't want them to be like Hitler's youth. We want them to have individuality. But it is also important for them to bear in mind that in order to keep the freedom which allows the diversity of individuality, it's necessary sometimes to be totally disciplined and to give up some freedom in order to keep all freedom for the future.
During your time in Peking, you got to sit next to one of the great charmers in the history of the world, Mao's wife. What were your impressions of her?
Well, frankly, of course, she was not in her prime when I saw her, but I rather wondered why he had married her. But it was his fourth wife, and I understand, according to some, probably unfriendly critics of Mao, that she seduced him from his third wife. Whatever the case might be, she was very, very intense. What I remember most about her that night was that she was sweating. The sweat was pouring down from her head and so forth. And I sort of wondered what was the matter, and she apologetically said that she'd been having some influenza. But I think it was tension. And as distinguished from the grace of Zhou Enlai and the warm hospitality of Mao, despite the fact that I knew that ideologically we were total enemies, she was one that made no bones about the fact that she didn't like us. I remember she turned to me in the middle of one of the performances and said, "Why did you wait so long to come to China? Why didn't you come before?" And I just ignored it and just kept looking at the performance. She was also interested. It showed at least that she had followed what had happened in America. She was interested in what happened to Jack London. Some way that had appealed to her. She said, "What did he die of?" And I, not being a London expert, I guessed pretty good. I said, "I think it was alcoholism." She asked about Walter Lippmann, who's incidentally, she had read some of his columns in the Christian Science Monitor, which shows that some of the papers are distributed there. And I made a point which I hoped got back to Mao. I assumed that it did, assuming she was still on speaking terms with him, which I can't be sure of. But I said, well, he's over 80, but I talked to him on the phone recently, and I had on his 80th birthday, and that he's still very sharp. And so much for that.
Was she the only leading, powerful woman you met in China?
On that trip, yes. Although I would say this, I did meet Zhou's wife, Zhou Enlai's wife, and she was a gracious, charming, sophisticated woman. Although in her own right, as I learned when I saw her in '76 and paid a courtesy call on her, Zhou Enlai had died just before I got there in '76. In her own right, she was a Communist Party leader. But she was more Chinese in meeting her guests, as the case might be. But generally speaking, I remember many, many years ago, during the time of the Hiss case, when we were questioning Alger Hiss and then his wife Priscilla Hiss, that Chambers made an interesting observation. He said, when you meet a communist couple, generally you will find that the woman is the red hot of the two. And I have generally found that that's true not just of communism, but of politics generally. Women are less compromising, they're more idealist, more ideological, and they're more intense, they're less forgiving, and certainly she fit that right to a T. I compared her in my mind's eye too with the other great Chinese woman who was the wife, I compare her with another woman who was the wife of a great Chinese leader, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And she's a Wellesley graduate, highly sophisticated, gracious, charming, and very tough and very intelligent in standing up for the views that she believed in and in representing her husband around the world. They were two very different people. But one, Mao's wife, was frankly one that simply turned me off because of her attitude, not just for what she stood for. She just didn't have any grace. Zhou Enlai had grace. And Mao, in his own way, had some charm. But this woman, nothing.
Do you count it as among the worst offenses of the Chinese Revolution that it suppressed the beauty of some of the world's most beautiful women?
I think it was a great mistake, and I think they're going to have to rectify it and already are. In some of the books that I read before I went there, old China hands, those that presume to be experts, and I don't think anybody's an expert, the more you know about China, the less you know about China. It will always be that way. But in any event, they wrote to the effect that the Chinese communists were trying, of course, to make a new man in China, but they were also trying to put the women into that same category. And it was very difficult because women traditionally in China have played a very interesting role. Oh, it's subordinate in a way, but also independent in a way. You know, you see Chinese women in the great cities like Hong Kong, Manila, etc., and they have the grace, the charm, the beauty. They're some of the great beauties of the world, the Chinese. They love color, and when you go to China, and particularly in 1972, I didn't see any color at all. The women translators were dressed in these Mao suits, big baggy pants, and so forth. They looked just like the men, the short-cut hair, no style, no makeup. And then it subtly began to change. By 1976, just a tiny bit of color would show out under the Mao coat or jacket on the dress beneath. And curiously enough, not that this is terribly important, but it does show you they had to compromise some. When I went there in 1982, they still had women translators, but they were dressed, believe it or not, in very, very beautifully tailored slack suits, beautifully colored, and in the evening they wore nice dresses. I asked one of them where they got it, and she blushed a little. She says, "I got it when I was in Hong Kong." Although the Chinese themselves are very good at fabrics, as we're learning with having to compete with them.
How significant is something like that? Can the length of a hemline or a piece of blouse beneath a cuff indicate major social change?
Only if you put it in its total context and its proper context. What it does indicate that the Chinese communists found that it was impossible to force their system, impersonalizing everybody, equalizing everybody on the mass of the Chinese people. It just isn't working. So subtle changes are taking place. How significant they are remains to be seen. It's the same thing with regard to such as the fact that now, compared with 1972, in 1972, as you went along the streets of Peking and the other cities, everybody was walking. Hundreds of thousands walking, or I should say shuffling. By 1982, most of them were on bicycles and a few cars and so forth. In 1972, no TV. 1982, several million sets of TV, and importing some, and exporting, I should say, some sets in Southeast Asia, which they proudly told me then. What does this mean? Part of it is material progress, and that can happen in a communist country as well as any other. But in terms of allowing more diversity, more freedom, even in such things as clothes, that must tell us something as well.
On the principle that it's hard to keep people down on the collective farm after they've seen Paris, does this kind of liberalization, will it present a problem to the communist leadership? Can you give an inch and not have people take a mile when you're giving them this kind of freedom and diversity?
That's the problem they have. It's the great dilemma. It's a great dilemma in a broader sense. Let's put it in its economic context. In 1972, I remember some of the fatuous suggestions to the effect that I saw it in one column in particular that I won't quote for the moment as far as to who wrote it, but I remember it so vividly. He said, when President Nixon goes to China, the first question that Mao Zedong is probably going to ask him is, will the world's richest nation help the world's most populous nations, and how can it help it? Well, that, of course, misinterpreted why they came to a rapprochement with us and why we went there. It did not have at that time anything to do with economics. And the Chinese didn't raise economic questions whatever with us. We had to raise it with them in terms of economic cooperation. That was 1972. But now it's changed a great deal. China is still concerned about its survival. And that requires that the United States be strong enough and have the will to deter Soviet aggression and Soviet threats against them or anybody else. That's on the survival side. But China also is concerned about progress. It's a terribly poor country. In order to have progress, they need more diversity. They need more freedom. They need more private enterprise. For example, you mentioned collective farms. The only agriculture that is productive in China today are on small plots that are being given to the peasants to run on their own where they can make a profit. In some of the cities, you will find privately owned and privately operated groups and so forth and so on. The problem the Chinese have with this, however, is that if they are going to have more progress, they've got to have more freedom. In order to keep power, they have to have less. Because the moment you set up private plots, privately owned concerns, more freedom and diversity for people and so forth, the more you set up the potential power centers that will not continue to accept the domination of a one-party state.
Did you meet Marshal Ye, the military leader on this trip?
No, on my last trip in 1982, I asked to meet him, but he was not well. And shortly thereafter, he resigned his top position. But I have vivid memories of him in 1972 because he was the one who accompanied me on the trip to the Great Wall. He was a perfectly delightful man, knew some English, was one of Mao's associates in the Long March, and was particularly interested, I recall vividly, in what we were doing about cancer. I didn't know why he was asking that question, and it seemed to me rather ironic. It was cancer that killed Mao later.
Zhou Enlai.
No, it's cancer that killed Zhou Enlai later. And I would say that one of the benefits of our relationship, or I would say, I think that one of the most useful things we've had, and we did set up, out of that summit, we did set up a joint cancer research activity between the two countries. Because who knows, we think we're so smart in this country. We've got certainly the best medical care in the world, and we think the best doctors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if there is an answer to cancer, it may not be in the United States. Maybe it's somebody in China, might be somebody in Africa, might be somebody in Latin America. And my view is, let's share all of that wisdom in some way, find that one individual who will find that answer.
Did Mao and Zhou talk about Chiang Kai-shek, and how did they refer to him?
It was sort of a mixed reaction. I think as Chinese, they respected him. As communists, they hated him because he was their enemy. But they spoke to him with a considerable amount of respect. I remember Mao, in a rather interesting sidelight, he said, I noticed that our old friend Chiang Kai-shek does not like your coming here. He always calls us bandits. And I said, well, what does the chairman call Chiang Kai-shek? He says, oh, we call him bandits too sometimes. We abuse each other. But then he went on to say, but I should remind you that our friendship with him goes back much further than yours.
What do you think will happen in US-Taiwan relations?
But the United States will and should continue to provide defensive weapons for Taiwan. But the level of assistance should be directly related to the offensive threat. That is what the Shanghai II communique, which settled, at least temporarily, this burning issue a few months ago, provides. On the Chinese side, looking at Peking, it is important then, if they want the level of arms to Taiwan reduced, they must reduce the threat. And the United States should continue to insist, as we did in the Shanghai Communique in 1972, and this also is the line in all other statements between the two countries, that the issue between Peking and Taipei be settled peacefully. I also should point this out, however. I have no concern about any danger that Peking is going to launch an amphibious war against Taiwan. They have the Russians to worry about. They'd be out of their minds to do that. The second point I should make is this, and this is something that our friends in Taiwan and some of the friends of Taiwan in the United States have overlooked. The greatest and the most indispensable, second point, and there's another point that should be made, and that is this is something that our friends in Taiwan and the friends of Taiwan in the United States have often overlooked, that the most indispensable factor in guaranteeing the security of Taiwan is a good relationship between the United States and Peking. If we have that relationship, that may restrain them. If Peking has a relationship like that with the Soviet Union, then Taiwan is in mortal danger. I do not see any solution working out in the near future, perhaps some sort of a Commonwealth status in which Taiwan retains its economic and social character, as Hong Kong, of course, must as well. Maybe that will happen. I'm not prepared to say. But at the present time, we should keep the issue where it is. Taiwan is in no danger. It will continue to have its own economic system and continue to prosper. And I think that as long as we do not provoke Peking by either our statements or our actions in providing more than is needed for defense to Taiwan, Peking, they'll huff and puff, but they will do nothing.
Do you think there's a danger that a Democratic or a liberal Republican president would withdraw our support from Taiwan, and what would the impact of that be?
Well, there is the danger, but it would be a very great mistake. A great mistake because if we in effect say to Peking, look here, we're withdrawing all our support, we're breaking our economic relations, which is what we really have at the present time, primarily, and whatever military support that we're giving, it would simply encourage Peking to move on Taiwan, to move on it, recognizing that they would have no problem as far as we're concerned. No, that's not the thing to do. I don't think it's going to happen for that reason, even though some might be tempted to do it.
How do you evaluate the China relationship in the years since you left office?
Well, I think we have to look at it in the long view and then in the short view, too. In the long view, it has not accomplished as much as I would have hoped, but more than many expected. For example, 10 years ago, there was no trade between China and the United States. Last year, it was $5.5 billion. 10 years ago, there were no Chinese students studying in the United States. Last year, there were 12,000. 10 years ago, there were no American tourists in China. Last year, there were over 100,000. Now, that is some progress in those particular areas. In terms of the geopolitical relationship, the strategic relationship between the two, it's had its ups and downs. After all, Mao died, Zhou Enlai died. We've had new presidents in the United States. We've had Ford and then Carter and now Reagan. And consequently, you don't have the smooth road that you would normally expect under those circumstances. But I would say that as far as that relationship is concerned today, that while what brought us together, the Soviet threat, is really because of the fact that the Soviet Union now has at least parity with the United States overall in nuclear strength, while that threat is greater than it was 10 years ago, in terms of the Chinese mind, it could be slightly less, although that is something that I don't think anybody can judge at this point. So under the circumstances, I think it's important for us to recognize that in order to keep the Chinese-American rapprochement healthy, it is necessary to add to it another factor. It's a factor that's already there, but that is in a very, very minimal state of growth, and that is the economic factor. I don't think it makes any sense, for example, for the United States to have more liberal trading policies insofar as technology is concerned with India, which is more under Soviet control than Peking, to put it mildly, than we have with Peking. I think it's very important for us to expand dramatically, for us, the Japanese and the Europeans, our economic ties with the People's Republic of China, having in mind that the Chinese leadership will continue to look west if, one, they believe that the United States has the will and the power to help guarantee their survival. And two, from the positive standpoint, they will continue to look west if they feel that in order to have progress, it is better to turn west and everything that we can offer than to turn east toward the Russians. And so I think if we play it that way, the key is in our own hand as to whether the rapprochement will grow or whether it will wither and die, and they will turn toward the Russians.
Do you think that their fears of the Russians are justified? Do you think that the Russians would jump them if they had the chance and thought they could beat them?
The question is whether or not the Soviet leaders, looking as they usually do down the long haul rather than short term, whether they feel that they must neutralize China now when China is weaker, and particularly weaker in terms of nuclear capability, because right now the Soviet Union could have a successful first strike, preemptive strike against China, or whether they wait until China becomes a formidable force. My view is that the likelihood of their doing it is relatively small. But I think at times they might be tempted. But that brings us to another point. It's very important not to give them provocation. Now, I know that some of our China watchers and Soviet watchers say, gee, wouldn't it be great if these two fought each other? And then we have the two great communist powers destroying each other. And the answer is it wouldn't be great at all. The answer is that if those two powers do fight, it will escalate into a world war. Also, putting it another way, if you allow tensions between Peking and Moscow to grow and develop and be exacerbated to the point that Moscow feels it has been provoked and has a right to attack China, then the question is, what do we do? Are we going to stand with them? Can we allow the whole geopolitical balance in the world to be changed by having the Soviet Union take over China?
Is that why a Sino-Soviet war would become a world war?
No, a Sino-Soviet war could become a world war for that reason, potentially, assuming that the United States would react, and I'm not suggesting they would or wouldn't. But it would for another reason. In the event that there's a Sino-Soviet war, it is bound to escalate into nuclear war, and I am convinced that nuclear war is not going to be contained whenever it happens.
In what way?
Well,
I mean, what other nuclear power would become involved?
When the nuclear genie gets out of the bottle, and those things start flying around, and with all these alarm systems going off and the rest, I just have no confidence at all it can ever be contained.
Are there any contacts now between the Soviets and the Chinese? Do you see the possibility of a rapprochement developing?
Yes. There's no question about the fact that there are contacts, and the Chinese always make it very clear to us that there are. They, at the same time, say they have no illusions about the difficulty of reaching a rapprochement. But we should not object to those contacts. If they can reduce the possibility of border incidents that might escalate into war or give the Soviet a provocation, we should welcome that. But when you look at the conditions the Chinese have laid down, the possibility that the Soviet will be able to satisfy them are remote, because the Chinese have said the Soviet have got to quit supporting Vietnam, and Vietnam is an enemy of China at the present time on its southern border, that they've got to get out of Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union can't get out of Afghanistan, because that basically is a counter-revolution. They can't allow counter-revolution to succeed. The Chinese are concerned about the Soviet ties to India, because India on the south is more, there's certainly considerable Soviet influence, at least Soviet support for the Indian armed forces. And under the circumstances, they're concerned about